Hello and welcome to this webinar brought to you by BBC Global News. I'm Samantha Adams, Vice President, Advertising Sales for Western Europe. As we all know, world leaders are due to meet in the UK in November for COP26. The summit is being hailed as the last hope at limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, a make or break year to confront the global climate emergency. While there's growing momentum from governments and businesses to address climate change, there's still a lot of pressure on leaders to be even more ambitious. I'm delighted to introduce the chair of our panel today, Martha Henriquez, the editor of Future Planet. Available on bbc.com, Future Planet focuses on global solutions to climate change, pollution, and sustainability. Its coverage includes local voices from around the world, so Martha is the perfect person to host this session, which will examine the key issues for COP26, the promises and progress made, and of course, some of the solutions. I'll hand over to Martha to introduce the panel. Martha.
Thanks very much, Sam. And I'm delighted to be hosting this session at this important time in the run-up to COP26. So now let me introduce our panel of BBC experts in science and environment reporting. Today we have Justin Rowlett, the BBC's Chief Environment Correspondent. He's travelled the world for the BBC and seen the evidence of climate change firsthand. And he's known for his work on programmes such as Panorama, Newsnight's Ethical Man and The One Show. And Justin is with us until about 12:30 when he has to run off for the 1 o'clock news. We also have Naveen Khadka, who is the multilingual environment correspondent for the World Service. He'll bring a bit of a global perspective to this discussion. And Naveen reports in 4 languages for TV, radio, and online. And he focuses on climate-related disaster issues around the world. And he's been covering the UN climate change negotiations for nearly 20 years. And we also have award-winning BBC science correspondent Victoria Gill, who has reported on stories from missions to Mars to the changing climate and extinction crises here on Earth. And amongst other assignments during the pandemic, she's investigated and reported on the link between our relationship with the natural world and the emergence of diseases. So we have a lot of issues to cover, but just to start with, a quick question to my colleagues to set the scene before we get into a little bit more detail. So I wanted to know what each of you will be keeping a close eye on at the COP26 summit. What do you see as the critical area to watch? Justin?
I mean, the key thing here is, will the world reduce emissions by as much as it needs to? And let's not forget that the 6 or 7% reduction in carbon dioxide we saw in 2020, the pandemic year, was what we need to achieve every year up to 2030 if we're going to stay, this is what the climate scientists tell us, if we're going to stay within the 1.5 target that's been, the 1.5 ambition that's been set within the 2 degree target that the UN has. So that is the scale of the challenge. The question is, will the world rise to that challenge? And that, the central issue for the conference, is what I will be focusing on.
Naveen, what will you be keeping your eye on?
Well, it's almost the same thing what Justin has just now explained, but I'll also kind of keep an eye on what was left last time in Madrid. They said they agreed to agree next year, which never happened, and we're having it this year. The key thing here is about the carbon market thing. How did they thrash this out? Now, why am I saying this? That's because there are still countries that are asking they need to be paid what the carbon credits they earned during Kyoto regime. Now imagine scientists are saying that you need to do 5 times more than what you have pledged in your documents. And here are countries talking about Kyoto carbon credits. So it's very, very entrenched. That is something I will, apart from other points, I'd like to focus on. And
Vic, what will you be looking out for at COP26?
I mean, I think those are the key areas that Justin and Naveen have talked about. It's about those emissions reductions. I mean, that's central to it. We still are not on target, and we want those nationally determined contributions. So this is basically every country doing its own calculation to say what it will do to cut emissions. But as Naveen was saying, it is all about the money as well. If we're going to let the economic system as it stands up globally tackle this problem, then the rich countries need to step up with their financing, but we also need to start making polluters pay. And that means establishing a market in, you know, the way the economy works right now. That means establishing a market for carbon. So that held the Madrid talks up the last COP for basically the full fortnight, just wrangling over this issue because because countries were holding on to the fact that there have been carbon credits already issued and we want to be able to cash those in. And it's just time now to basically, it may be pie in the sky to say this, but it's time now to kind of start from zero and say, you know, we're all in the same boat here. We need to start making the cost to the planet a cost to countries and companies, and we really need to establish a system to be able to start financing what we need to do to protect the planet. So we'll really be watching how those financial negotiations work out and see if we can just move past those and start making some decisions about how we fix the mess we've got ourselves into.
I think they're all incredibly important points, and I'm also in the run-up to COP26. I'm particularly interested in seeing any of the updated NDCs that are coming in as a sort of measure of commitment ahead of the conference. So first of all, let's look at some of the sort of key points that are going to be playing a big role at COP26. So Vic, you've mentioned climate financing. So more than a decade ago, developed countries committed to mobilizing $100 billion per year by 2020 in support of climate action in developing countries. So I wonder, could we start with where are we on that promise and why is it so important?
Not there and not close is the short answer. And Naveen will have a lot more to say on this, especially in the parts of the world that he reports from and for. But essentially, we have a long way to go to meet that target of richer countries stepping up to finance adaptation and finance the countries that will suffer most but have done least to cause climate change. So really, you know, when we talk about that issue of it being the kind of the last chance to hit that target of staying under 1.5, it's also the last chance to step up and pay the amount of money that it will take to help countries join that global fight, because we're all really in this together. And there have been some amounts of money put on that it could be costing as much as 300 billion per year by 2030 for countries to adapt and put in place the measures that they need. So we really have fallen very far short, and we need leadership. We need those richer countries. You know, we failed to kind of make a plan in the G7, so we've not set a good foundation here for these COP talks, and that worries me. We need we need countries to step up and to really commit to paying their share. And really, I think we need the UK to take a big lead in this, because they're going to be hosting it and they need to set an example.
Absolutely. And Naveen, what are your thoughts on that?
So, you know, we've been hearing this from developing world. And when I say developing world, it's both. It's actually, you know, those least developed countries as they are known, or maybe, you know, small island states. And then also rapidly emerging economies like even China, India, saying that you're not giving us money, you see. So we've got a bit of a two camps here. So India, China, Brazil, for example, or South Africa, they would kind of talk about this, that you're not giving money, but you know, they are actually to some degree themselves capable of doing things on their own, although they say that we also need help. But there are the countries I mentioned, the least developed countries or small island states, and they say that, you know, we are actually, when you two big boys are fighting, we are left in this lurch, and, you know, we are having to cope with this. So just now, you know, today, I'm sure you've seen this report that's come out. It says, and we know there's no dearth of all these reports. It says that, you know, just these poor countries, least developed countries, they received just 3% of what they needed in between 2014 and 2018. This is the latest study I've got here. As I said, there are lots of studies here. So, you know, poor countries are always saying that you said this $100 billion a year, long back, it's nowhere to be seen. And actually, OECD itself also has produced this report saying that it's not delivered. And the issue here is this adaptation thing. You know, even of that finance, that money, how much is actually going to these countries to help them adapt to these inevitable impacts they're having to live with? That's the question. And the findings are that, it's very, very nominal. It's almost non-existent. And even this latest report says that the participation of local communities, it's almost nil, zero. And that is where it is. But when we say this, when we talk about these accusations that poor countries are making against rich countries, we also need to bear in mind their own situations, the governance, the politics, the instability in these countries. You see, just yesterday, I was talking to some countries in, for example, Latin America, and they say that, the governments in sense, for example, the central Latin America, they were talking about countries like Honduras, Guatemala, for example. They've got this dry corridor now, and they're trying to do something about it, where people are just running away from there, and as a result, trying to get into US and so on and so forth. But what they say are, the governments in these regions they're not according the priority to this topic as well. You see, when we have these negotiations, we tend to just hear from those negotiators. They are making the noises that we haven't got money, but back home, what are their countries, what are their governments, what are their policymakers doing? Are they really, honest about it? In many cases, I find that that's another issue. That's really another issue, even if they had the money. But again, that is not to give a clean sheet to the donor countries, which they promised.
And so on this sort of note of inequality with regards to climate between rich and poorer nations, and we've had a question come in from Ed Scott, who wants to ask, are richer countries simply going to push heavy polluting industries and services to poorer countries to achieve their own targets? Perhaps, Justin, would you be able to speak to that?
Yeah, I can begin to talk to that. I mean, obviously, that's a danger. I think often when we talk about this, we talk about it, as if it's a sort of kind of deliberate strategy. Actually, if you look there's another way of looking at it, which is that imposing restrictions on your economy in order to encourage it to use less carbon, the kind of things we're talking about doing here in Britain, the kind of things that yesterday the European Union said it would be doing, are effectively imposing a tax. Some of them are more expensive than using fossil fuels. So, for example, let's take Europe, because it's actually putting in place real changes. Europe's saying, we're going to restrict your access to fossil fuels, make it more expensive for you to use them. And that is going to push up the price, because fossil fuels underpin everything, that will push up the price of production in Europe. So the threat to Europe, in a way, is the other way around. Are countries using high carbon techniques going to sell cheaper goods into Europe and undermine these cleaner industries they're trying to develop? So in response to that, I mean, you could argue it the other way, but I'm putting it in that way just to show you that there is a kind of nuanced debate here. In order to stop that happening, Europe and America, and indeed China as well, are all talking about the possibility of imposing carbon tariffs on imports. What does that mean? It means that if I'm trying to sell a sofa to you in France, there'll be a question about how much carbon has gone into making it. If it's very high carbon, there'll be an additional cost imposed at the border. So the Europeans would say leveling up the cost to reflect that. Now, in a way, think about what that's saying to exporting countries. It's saying, listen, you use a lot of carbon, we're going to tax you. There's an incentive there for them to reduce the amount of carbon they use. So the optimistic way to present this could be, hold on a second, Europe, China, America, the three biggest economic groups in the world, if we get all of them, more than 50% of the world economy saying we're going to start imposing carbon tariffs, there's a powerful mechanism there, if you think about it, for driving other countries to reduce their carbon emissions. So yes, there is a danger of this, what you describe as exporting high carbon activities abroad, and there's certainly a claim that that's happened in the past. But if these structures are put in place, there's another way of looking at it, which is this will actually drive decarbonisation all across the world.
And I think if I could just add to that as well, I think like Justin's really hit on a central tension there, and why this wrangling over this financing and how to kind of put this new market in place has caused so many problems and so many delays. But it also hits on why this is an interlinked problem with the protection of the natural world and the restoration of the natural world being absolutely intrinsically linked with how we get to the root of the climate change problem. Because you need also, every country needs to put a value on biodiversity and nature. So it's not just about carbon, it's about any pollution, destruction of the natural world. That's expensive to us as humans. It's expensive to the planet. So it should be expensive. And it should be something that every single country puts a value on. So it's a bit of a problem that the other COP that we're all looking at as environment reporters this year, that's about biodiversity, that was set to take place in Kunming in China, has been delayed, because that would have been a real springboard, and especially the location of that and the host of that being China, such an important contributor to these international negotiations. So I think that's something that needs to be factored in it, and it might, worryingly, it might be something of a stumbling block that those negotiations have not already taken place by the time we get to Glasgow, if we get to Glasgow, COVID permitting.
Absolutely. I've got a couple more questions about nature-based solutions and the link between nature loss and climate change a little bit later. But first of all, I just wanted to go into a little bit more detail around the issue of carbon markets. So, you know, as we've already heard, one of the big issues to resolve at the COP summit is finding agreement on the rules for global carbon markets. No agreement has been reached at previous summits, and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says that, you know, this issue can't keep being sort of battered from one COP to another. And, you know, we've talked about this a little bit already, but why exactly have carbon markets proven such a tricky thing to pin down and agree in these negotiations previously? And can we expect anything different this time?
If you went back to the Kyoto regime, you know, even then things were not so straightforward, but by and large, it had kicked off and we were so optimistic. But you know how it crashed. The value of carbon literally crashed, and there were also scandals. We heard about all these countries claiming carbon credits unduly. They didn't have to, and yet they did, and so on and so forth. And therefore, this rule book, this carbon market thing, we're talking about Article 6, to be precise, they're trying to address all these issues. But like I said, you know, just for the benefit of our audiences, to keep things simple, you know, when they talked about, okay, how would we deal this? How would we make it straightforward? How would we make it just? And so on and so forth. And here are countries that are demanding the payment first, what they earn, the carbon credits. And I'm still surprised. I thought that was gone because that was in 2019. And when I follow what happened during other meetings now in the run-up to COP26, I'm hearing that there are some countries still sticking though to those demands, saying that first we need to be paid. What are you going to do about those credits? And the thing is, again, you don't know. You see, it could be just a kind of negotiation tactic. The thing is, what we need to know here is when these negotiations happen, I've heard this many times that, you know, countries, for example, China has repeatedly said that you cannot just thrash out one thing separately. It's a package. You know, and then they have gone on to say that, you know, we would also have to bring in the trade war, what's happening with the US, you see what I mean? So what happens is these countries, if they really stick to those carbon credits, and if they're not being paid, or if they won't be paid, and if they really, you know, if they dug the hill, then definitely it will be really, you know, it won't move. And that is why Anthony Guterres warning COP after COP, you know, let's forget it. But the thing is, can we forget it? Because these are the negotiators. Like I said, 200 countries, they'll have to agree. You know, there are all these templates. You'll have to abide by all those processes. So if again, this posturing, if it continues, then it definitely is going to be a difficult one. Otherwise, if they forgot that, then, and if they agree that, okay, let's forget the past and let's start afresh, then I think there is a ray of hope that things might work. But again, as I said, we still are, there are some fundamental questions, some countries' policies, how serious are they about climate change? How serious are they about their energy policies? And not to forget, this is something I really, would like to stress on, the pandemic. What has the pandemic done to this agenda? That what I talked about was pre-pandemic. After the pandemic, things have changed. Governments have said categorically, many governments have said that they would now use whatever is readily available to reboot their battered economies. Mm-hmm. And we have seen examples. What is India doing? What is China doing? What are other countries doing? So indeed, very challenging.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. And Justin, just before, because I know you have to leave us fairly soon, but I wanted to ask you two questions. Firstly, on carbon markets, what would you see as a good result from this COP26? And secondly, it's obviously been a big year for the UK in terms of the G7 and then COP26 in November. And what would good leadership from the UK look like at COP26?
Well, those are big questions. Any agreement over carbon markets would be a huge improvement. I think we need to, let's zoom out a little and think about what this means. What we're talking about with carbon markets is trying to attach a price to releasing carbon into the atmosphere. Now think about how pervasive the use of fossil fuels, carbon emitting fuels is. So what essentially we're talking about is changing the underlying cost of doing almost everything in society. Of course, coming to an agreement on that is going to be difficult, particularly when you remember that some countries, as Naveen's alluded to, some countries have historically emitted much more carbon and are therefore, in a very real sense, more directly responsible for the climate change we're experiencing. Then we come to Vic's point, which is, look, we're all in this together. We've got to get something on the table. We saw a huge step forward in agreement in Paris. So in Paris, all the countries of the world, the key thing that happened at Paris was all the countries of the world said, yes, we recognize this is a problem and we all need to work together to deal with it. Now, extraordinarily before that, some countries were saying, we're not going to be part of this. You guys sort it out. We've got to get on with our own development. So that was the huge step at Paris. It would be not quite as big a step, but it would be a very big step if we got an agreement on carbon markets and, a way of pricing carbon, trying to begin, because this is the beginning of a long journey, trying to begin to price the impact of carbon into the economic system. And what that does, think about just for a moment so we understand what we're talking about, what that is trying to do, you push the price of, for example, filling your car up with petrol or diesel. Hopefully that's a slight disincentive for you to drive quite so far. You use a little bit less carbon. That's what this whole thing is attempting to do, create an incentive for us all to use less carbon. And because if you have a carbon market and the prices of everything change, it is systemic, it works throughout the whole economy. So it's hugely ambitious, could be transformational, but is the subject of huge debate. Your second question on leadership. What does good leadership look like? Good leadership on this issue, I think, is very subtle. And I think it happens in quiet discussions in rooms away from the spotlight, the journalistic spotlight, if you like. What has been happening is Britain and, we've got to be absolutely clear, America under Biden has taken a huge interest in this. John Kerry, America's climate envoy, and Alok Sharma, who runs COP26 for the UK, have been traveling around the world. Despite COVID, they've been quietly flying on planes and going to see the leaders of these countries or their relevant counterparts across the world, including China, including Russia, everywhere you can think of, and have been saying, listen, guys, let's do some kind of deal. So success. So this is what's been happening quietly in the background. To be honest, I think I speak for all of us when I say we don't know how well that's going. So hopefully good leadership will see as everybody comes together, and hopefully, fingers crossed, they will all be there in person. That is certainly, I spoke to COP26 this week, that's their intention. As many people, as much like a normal COP as possible, they say, we will gradually see a consensus around some of the issues that we've discussed already today emerging, and hopefully at the end, a decision to commit, for example, to carbon markets. That is what success would look like. Let's be clear what we want. Coming back to that first point I made, we want countries to raise their ambitions to cut carbon in line with what the science is telling us. That good leadership would deliver that result. We may not get that, we'll get something probably hopefully approaching that, but that is what good leadership would look like. Tough call on the British government.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I have an interesting question here through from Tom Bowman, which is beyond money. Are COP26 attendees going to sign up to solutions like circular economics? So moving a little bit away from sort of the finances in the sort of traditional sense, should we also be thinking about sort of the circular economy as well? And is that something that we might, you know, see featured at COP26 in the discussions?
I think certainly every, you know, this, it's like we've already touched on the fact that this hits on every aspect of our lives, and you know, almost every industry, every job, every form of transport that we take, everything we use that we do, it has some kind of carbon emission attached to it and has some kind of impact on the planet that we live on. But I think central to these negotiations are going to be those nationally determined contributions. Are going to be countries saying, this is what we will do to cut our emissions, and doing those calculations and bringing them to the table. And there's going to be, you know, there'll be key players that will be watching do that. And then fundamentally, it is also all about the money. So getting over those initial hurdles to be able to set every nation on its own journey, because beyond 2024, we then want every single country to be coming back saying, this is how it's going, this is how we're doing. And then things like, once we've got that kind of value chain in place, things like circular economies, you know, where we're getting more value out of the materials that we're using because we're recycling and reusing things, that fits into setting up an economic structure whereby, you know, all of those materials have more value, and it costs to be throwing them away or wasting things that have a carbon cost attached to them. So I think that's much more of a down the line consequence of a success at COP, with promising and actually setting targets to cut emissions and setting out to pay for that as well.
So maybe not something that we'll hear sort of discussed at COP, but, you know, very sort of dependent on the.
I think we'll hear, I mean, all of this, COP is going to be such an interesting event if, you know, hopefully it takes place in the form that they intend, because there's two zones to it. We've already been discussing as reporters and, you know, within the BBC is how we cover this, because there's kind of additional complications with COVID, but also, like, that aside, we've got this kind of central negotiating table, and we've also got this huge kind of much more multifaceted event in what's called the green zone around the outside of that. And that's going to be full of demonstrations and different organizations and NGOs pitching up to be part of this very important global event and this very symbolic event, and wanting to kind of send out their message and talk to each other. So I think we'll hear a lot about that, and we'll hear a lot of stories about, you know, how our economies can change and how we can use things differently and do things differently in all of those kind of satellite events around COP, because COP isn't just, you know, one table where all of these countries come to hammer out this deal. It's also this huge event that's just all about how we move forward more sustainably on this planet.
Naveen,
can I quickly add this here? So you know, to answer that question, what I've noticed in the past few years is, you know, after the every COP ends, so, you know, there is a press release or statement issued that what is done, yeah? And there is one particular thing that gets placed nowadays. It's been happening for the past few years now. It's called the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. That kind of definitely gets a place there. And that, the idea of the UN, I mean, you know, very artistically does that. You know, it kind of gets it in there that, guys, this is not just about climate per se. It's also about this. So, and then definitely no countries would say, no, we don't want that. The countries would say, yes, we want it. The question here is, again, like, you know, once they sign that paper, when they go back, what do they do? That's the question. So if you ask me, you know, my lens, my binoculars would extend to what is even beyond this COP26, what they say there and what they go and do back at their countries, at their home level.
And we just had another question in from Tom Bowman, which speaks to some of the points you were making, Vic, on actually how we cover COP and related issues at the BBC. So Tom's asking, should BBC News interviews raise sustainability issues more often, for example, as the norm rather than as a separate item?
I mean, I hope we do. I think there's a definite kind of change of culture within our reporting that's been, you know, I've been with the BBC around about 11 years, and it definitely used to be the case, and I hope my editors wouldn't mind me saying this, but it used to be the case that when I went to outlets with a story that was about climate change, it was kind of considered that would be the science story of the day. So that would have its own particular slot, and we wouldn't have another story on, say, the same bulletin at 6 o'clock that would be about climate change or about any other kind of science and environment topic. I think now sustainability and just the issue of climate change is so very pervasive, and as it should be, and it's so much in everybody's consciousness, and we're aware of the audience's understanding of it, and that they're really prioritizing it, that it's very important to them, especially our younger audiences, and our younger audiences are really important to us. So I hope and I think that our coverage is taking that into account. You know, now our transport correspondent is doing a lot more about sort of sustainable and green travel, and our business team are doing a lot more about sustainability within their own remit. It's not just something that's parked in the corner for the science and environment team. And I think that, you know, that reflects how the culture is changing within the UK and hopefully around the world, as consciousness increases of how important this issue is, and that, you know, we really are in a race against time, that climate change needs to be considered and sustainability needs to be considered in every single policy decision that's made. So it needs to be intrinsic to all of our decisions within, you know, within the Department for Business, the Department for Transport, every, you know, new housing estate that's built, every new industry that starts. There needs to be a kind of calculation done on how sustainable that is and what the carbon cost of that will be. So I hope so. It's been a bit of a slow change, and I think it possibly mirrors how we're not keeping pace with, you know, how quickly we need to catch up with the carbon debt that we're getting ourselves into as far as, you know, global warming goes. But we are, hopefully COP will be a real kind of catalyst for that, I think.
I think, if anything, it might be one lesson that's come from the pandemic as well, in that, you know, sometimes a health story is the only story, and it you know, it affects absolutely all of the items covered. And in the same way as climate change increasingly is recognised as the overarching, you know, crisis of our period, it's going to be filtering through to all of the news more and more.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting as well. Naveen was talking about a report that was released this morning. We had a report that developing nations have contributed to, essentially saying that it's time for richer countries to stop dithering and to really commit to the financing that's needed to bring everybody to the table and get everybody on a more level playing field when it comes to climate change. And I think the pandemic's actually been a real lesson there. You know, it hasn't been an equalizer at all. So you look at it, we've almost had like a test run of how the world treats every other nation, you know, and how it's being kind of separated between like global north and global south and rich and poor. You look at the vaccine distribution. We have an acute crisis of the pandemic, and there's been a very unequal distribution of the vaccine. That's a real worry, because does that, you know, show us when it comes to the crunch, when really important, you know, life-changing decisions are to be made, where our priorities go. And I think that's a real salutary lesson when we're inviting, you know, the UK as host, when we're inviting all these nations to the table. We need to take that as a lesson, recognize it, and say that inequity cannot happen with climate change, because we are all in this together.
Naveen, has the pandemic changed the way that you think about the climate crisis in relation to more climate vulnerable nations or less developed countries?
Yes, I mean, this is something I can't stress enough, actually, because I've been following, you know, these different countries' policies and what they're saying, particularly after the pandemic, and what they've said. How would they try to come out, you know, to reboot their battered economies? So in doing that, I mean, definitely, you know, we have all these different nice, you know, I mean, they're good, actually. For example, Build Back Better, or, you know, the green growth, you know, all those kind of things. And this narrative that this crisis can be an opportunity to address climate change, to embark into the sustainable way of doing things. And there are figures about how many jobs will be created, even the growth and so on and so forth. But the question is, the narrative is one thing, but is it happening? That's the question. And if you asked me, I've seen a number of reports, and they don't tell us very good stories. One, just to quickly refer to one report that was quite comprehensive, done by Bloomberg sometime back. They found out that major economies, so it was around $12 trillion stimulus packages being injected in the wake of pandemic, and they found out that hardly 1% was going to climate-friendly projects. And that is not it. After that, we have seen other reports as well, including IEA warning us that what's happening in terms of. So this is what worries me, and I'm clearly closely watching what's happening in India, in China, or in Indonesia, or in other parts of the world. And I'm not judging them, but what I'm saying is I've heard them saying that if you have a readily available resources, and if you can use that to get out of this crisis, why not? We'll definitely also think about climate change, but the priority, you see, that's the thing. So I think, but and in doing so, but the question here is, the argument here is to answer your question, the pandemic and climate change. So pre-pandemic, it was scientists were warning us about the same poor and vulnerable communities. And now we are hearing from certain leaders, certain countries that, well, actually, climate change is there. We'll definitely try to address them. But right now, because of the pandemic, the economy and all that, we'll have to address that because these people are the ones who are suffering, fair enough. But the thing is, if you end up emitting more carbon, if you end up, warming the world further up, and if the concentration of CO2 goes up high up there, and if the impacts accelerate, then it'll be those very poor communities, those very vulnerable communities who we are talking about to help now, they would be further jeopardized. They would be in trouble. This is the thing. So how do you balance that? How do you look at that? And that is where the narrative about this green growth, build back better, and so on and so forth will, again, this COP26, this is another thing that will they actually try to streamline this, mainstream this, get those countries to buy into that and do that. That's the challenge.
I just wanted to circle back to something that you were talking about earlier, Vic, on nature-based solutions and the other COP in Kunming. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services published a report.
Catchy title, isn't it, Martha?
It's so catchy and so hard to say. Published a joint report recently stating that the twin crises of nature loss and climate change are inextricably linked. I was interested in both of your thoughts on, has the link between these crises, has that really been appreciated in COPs at previous years? And might we expect a change in how we, the lens through which we're viewing both of these crises at COP26?
I don't think so. I don't think that in this context of these climate COPs, really how intrinsically linked the restoration and the protection of the natural world is with the climate crisis has been recognised. And I think that's partly because there's been so much difficulty with wrangling everybody in just on the same, to get everybody behind the same goal, which is reducing carbon emissions. That's been so very difficult that actually the mind-boggling problem of a million species under threat of extinction and the rate at which we're changing the face of this planet, it's just not really been on the table. And that's why this year was set to be, or last year until everything was postponed by the pandemic, but that's why this time, this COP was set to be a real kind of joined up event. So we were supposed to have the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services COP before the climate COP. And that, as hideously titled as that IPBES event is, it's basically an international agreement to decide how we're going to protect the natural world, how we're going to value it and how we're going to protect it. And there's two key things there. One is that's just crucially important. You know, we're rapidly driving a decline in species and a decline in biodiversity. And that's just, you know, it's the air that we breathe, it's the water we drink, it's the, you know, the planet on which we live is all of that natural space and the species that we share it with. The other thing that's more of a sort of nuanced diplomatic issue is that that event was set to be chaired by China. And that was a really important starting point to basically, if that agreement had been signed with China sort of holding the gavel, that would have brought China to the table at COP with the glow of that international agreement that's so incredibly important. So that not happening, they've done a really interesting thing with that, with the biodiversity COP, where they've opened it and sort of delayed proceedings until 2022 to give China that host's chair and try to maintain that sense of their overall control and involvement and glorification really in that whole issue. So hopefully that will really motivate things, because they're such an important player at the COP in Glasgow, because the two are intrinsically linked. And so we need to kind of be taking whatever comes of the agreement that we get to first, we need to be taking that and building it into when we get to the table and talk about nature, which in many ways is a much more complicated problem and just as important.
We have a question on that note from Michelle Schwarzer, and I hope I've pronounced that right. Michelle wants to know about programs for incentivizing, protecting and preserving biodiversity. What do you see as sort of the most impactful incentives for protecting nature? And, you know, obviously in the context of climate change as well, because as we know, the two solutions are often linked.
I think maybe Naveen might have a lot more to say on this than me, with his, you know, experiences in the parts of the world that he reports from. But just to keep harping on about it, I think a lot of it does come down to the money. You know, we know that with UN-backed systems that are put in place to protect, say, forests, there's a UN-backed program called RED, which is basically about paying communities to protect forests and prevent deforestation. And in brief, it's just not working. We can kind of learn lessons from that and see where certain countries have actually used it to reforest areas with monoculture plantations that they can then chop down and make things out of to export. So they've sort of actually added to the problem of deforestation and the driving down of biodiversity, and they've done it within the rules of this particular program. And so it's not funding the protection of nature, it's just sort of creating more complex problems. But I think that's key, that we need to learn lessons about what's not working and just sort of start from scratch, as we do with COP, with carbon markets. You know, it all comes down to having a financial structure set up where everyone just sort of wipes the slate clean and buys in and says, okay, we do need to fix this. And all of this, you know, all of these forests, all of these peatlands and this carbon market, this all has a value and this needs to be something that we pay for. But Naveen probably has a lot more to say kind of from on the ground about sort of what's working and what's not for communities in different countries.
When we talk about nature-based solutions, I think broadly we have two things here. First is definitely these are scientifically, asserted that they can be effective tool in the fight against climate change, basically to absorb carbon. And then, you know, even if when it comes to meeting your net zero targets, to offset, because you have certain quarters where you'll have to use fossil fuels and so on and so forth. But as I see, it's also about, you know, these nature-based solutions are not just about mitigation, it's also about adaptation. So what is said is, because the fact remains that we've already dumped so much of CO2 into the atmosphere, and, you know, the level, so the science, there have been warnings that even if we stopped all the emissions today, because we have done that already so much, there will be inevitable impacts. There will be, which we are witnessing now in different parts of the world. And if we continue emitting, they are going to get worse, which again, we are witnessing. So you see, what the scientists I talk to, basically on the ground, in different developing worlds, poor countries, what they say is these natural things, whatever natural resources you have, they could be used to shield these communities, to minimize those losses. So it's not just about mitigating climate change, it's also about adapting to those inevitable impacts. And they can be, you know, talk about the forest, talk about mangroves, talk about even coral reefs, talk about different systems. I'm even talking about, for example, how do you conserve, how do you protect the, for example, monsoon system? You know, to the monsoon system, how can it be, you know, because you might find this very interesting that, you know, how those rapidly melting glaciers, those fresh water mingling with salt water, how is it influencing monsoon, you know? And that monsoon now is kind of what it is doing, we all know every year. So those kind of things. But let me quickly add here, you see, and this is all in theory, but again, and these poor countries or rapidly, you know, rising economies, they all agree that, yes, you know, we have this nature-based solutions in terms of mitigation, in terms of adaptation. But here's the politics. The politics is, I've been following, you know, there's a block called BASIC, the Brazil, South Africa, China, and India. So they hold these meetings on a regular basis. During the last meeting, there was this issue of this thing, what we're talking about, you know, how do you dovetail, so to say, climate and biodiversity. And they all said that, well, it sounds so good, but we should be very careful about not obliging ourselves if there is this COP on biodiversity. And if they try to, via that route, if they make us commit for carbon reduction, see the politics, that's what they're talking about. We should be aware. So these are two different treaties, two different conventions. Don't mix them up. It's written in black and white. That's the level of politics. So that is where, you know, you have to see how do governments really make an agreement and how would they implement. I'm sorry, it is complicated, but it's the fact.
That's what we're mired in there, isn't it, Naveen? That's the worry about the, you know, we've got a very short amount of time, not just talking about the length of time of COP, but we're really, you know, scientists agree that if we don't cut emissions by almost half by 2030, that we're then, you know, we've kind of lost the race and we're then in carbon debt to the planet. Yep. So that's the worry, that we are mired in politics. You know, the entirety of the last COP was basically lost to politics. So we need to get past that. And yet the politics remains incredibly complicated and the costs remain incredibly high. You know, there was a global commission on adaptation that did a study looking at how much to invest in order to put in place the most important climate adaptation systems around the world. Because, you know, the fact is that climate change is already playing out. We're already seeing, you know, we're already seeing floods, we're seeing wildfires, we're seeing more heat waves. And a lot, that cost was $1.7 trillion US to invest to make back $7 trillion. So, you know, it's an investment that will pay back because you're building better infrastructure to protect your cities. You're saving lives because you're putting in early warning systems for things like flooding and tsunamis. You're improving agriculture by researching and providing drought-proof crops, for example, to safeguard food sources. But most of those adaptation measures are needed in countries where there is the least finance to pay for it, especially after the pandemic. So it just got a lot more expensive. There's quite a low amount of trust from those countries that need that investment from the richer countries in order to kind of level the playing field and get us all adapted, get this planet more adapted for the climate change that's already happening. And we're still, as Naveen says, mired in the politics. So I'm not hugely optimistic that we can kind of get out of that. But that's where we need that real ambitious, brave leadership. And, you know, hopefully, because it is so much the issue of our time, and, you know, it's the next generation that are gonna have to live with the consequences. So there's a moral obligation on everyone's shoulders here. Hopefully that leadership will come through at COP.
But I just wanted to talk about one other solution. We've talked about carbon markets, we've talked about nature-based solutions. But then I also wanted to talk about the net zero emissions as an opportunity for business and business as a solution. So Mark Carney, the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance, has called the transition to net zero the greatest commercial opportunity of our age. So I'm wondering, from your perspectives, is that how companies and governments are viewing it?
It's hard to know. I wasn't filled with confidence as far as the government's steps, that the UK government's steps that they have taken to actively pursue this net zero target. I've not been filled with confidence in recent days and weeks. I was covering a story yesterday about the transport plans, and essentially what our transport minister was saying was that we are all going to be able to keep moving around and on the roads, and particularly in the air, we're all going to keep flying guilt-free because technology will fix it. And at this point, it just seems that seems fantastical to me, because we don't have that technology yet to allow lower emission, let alone zero emission flights. There are hydrogen planes and there are electric planes, but they are tiny. They are not going to replace the jets that are taking people around the world at the moment. And the other issue is that the timeline just doesn't stack up. They're still talking about 2050, and really countries that have the room to invest, and especially when they have set out to be the hosts of something as hugely globally significant as COP, we really need to be talking about 2030. That's what all scientists agree on. So I think that there is, the fact is that the pandemic caused us to pause and caused almost every economy to, if not shrink, then at least pause and restart. So there is, in theory, a big opportunity there. I'm seeing it somewhat, like at least on a government level here, that there's not really the urgency to step up quickly to that challenge.
If I may quickly chip in here, what Vic said about governments, what they're saying, and they're pinning their hope on this technology will come. The BBC also covered, the same thing about what John Kerry said, that, where is that? How is it possible? And the answer was that there will be technologies, and we don't know if there will be technologies. It's working in progress. We don't know what's going to happen. But having said that, when I cover energy, particularly from rapidly rising economies, fast emerging economies, what they're telling me is, for example, India has a solid track record when it comes to their solar parks, or China for that matter, wind turbines. It's huge, massive. And yet what they're saying is we still need to, bank on fossil fuels, because that is the backup. Our renewable technology still lacks in a big way the battery technology to store the energy that we generate. So for example, there's this massive solar parks, 1 megawatt, 2 megawatt, 3 megawatt, installed capacity, but until the sun is there. The moment the sun is not there, they all go to sleep. Same with turbines. So, how do you store that energy? So that is something, and I'm still being told that it's still in a very nascent phase. Now, if we crack that, if we got some significant achievements on that, then perhaps it would be a game changer. Otherwise, these countries are telling us that we would very much like to, use these renewables and keep everything good. But, no, it's not possible. So that technology, and again, that it will happen. We will have the technology. We will have the technology. Mm-hmm. Will we have it? That's the question.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That the technology is there. When we do individual stories about amazing innovations in sustainable technology, everything's really is available and there to fix this problem. We do have renewable energy supplies. We do have battery technology that's getting better and better. We have renewable, we have ways of sort of using natural sources and recycling and reusing things. But I think there needs to be much more, while innovators are really stepping that up, there needs to be much more leadership from the politicians to basically set really stringent and ambitious and quite strict policies in place to put a price on, you know, tax carbon and basically make it cost more to be more polluting, and really push forward these cleaner technologies so that we can get there a lot quicker. Because, you know, 2050, yes, we'll probably have electric planes by then, but by then it'll be too late.
Absolutely. And so Dan Bending had a question on sustainable travel. Vic, I think you've covered that one. But just very, very quickly, before we round off, we have one question through from Isabel Cornice. So just a super quick answer on what is one action point that each of us can take away that will have the biggest influence on our individual impact on the climate and environment.
Oof. Individually, so I get a little bit stuck on this, but I think, you know, we can all make decisions about our impact on the planet that do make a difference, but ultimately it's the way that we vote, because it is going to take national leadership and international leadership to get us out of this mire and really kind of push the way forward. But I think, you know, think about what you eat, think about valuing the materials that you use, and you know, think about not wasting stuff. Do you need to buy as much as you do? I think us all as consumers, as we get labelled, can make decisions to just use that little bit less.
And Naveen, very quickly, what would your one solution be?
All these practical things that even our website has it, like how do we do it, what do we eat, how do we travel, and all that. Yeah, we could do that. But I think it's also about keeping this momentum. You know, we have social media now. You know, we will have to ultimately, again, what scientists say is the ultimate culprit is the emission. We'll have to address that. There's no way getting out of it. So to create that atmosphere, even, you know, whatever you can via social media discussion, keep that momentum, keep that, you know, bring those people under pressure, make them accountable, whoever it is. And I think that would be a contribution as well.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Naveen. And thanks everyone very much for your questions. And I will just hand back to Samantha Adams for a couple of last words.
Brilliant. Thanks, Martha. I really hope you have enjoyed this webinar brought to you by BBC Global News. Leading up to the COP26 summit, the BBC will have extensive coverage of all the important climate issues that affect us all. You'll be able to find those stories and information on TV, radio, and online. And of course, we'll be holding events like this as well. So thanks again to Martha and the panel, and thanks to everyone for their time today and for their questions. Goodbye.